Looks like we're probably live. Well, hello everyone. Robert Starmer here again with Cumulus Technologies. Today we're going to talk about development and specifically development relative to development for cloud, development in the cloud. Now, recently I've been talking a lot about the fact that cloud is really more of a set of tools and a set of processes rather than a place. So saying I'm going to do my development in the cloud is actually sort of a misnomer. It's kind of yes a disconnect between what the reality is and what we're trying to accomplish. Um, However, the inverse of that, developing locally, is I think becoming more and more of a liability, especially for a corporate entity. Now, if you're an individual developer or a small team, maybe developing locally is the only way you're actually going to be able to interact. Maybe that is the one tool set that you have available to you. That's fine. But once you start talking about a corporate entity, once you start talking about working with a community of developers, we really have to think differently about what development means. And from a corporate perspective, I almost think that the risk profile of allowing local development or access to and the ability to download resources into a local system are perhaps no longer valid. It's just not. It's a it's not a good idea to allow this level of risk. And we've seen, especially over the last couple of weeks, and again, this is early March 2023, we've seen some really high profile failures. And over time, we've seen high profile failures, but really the whole idea that you would have enterprise data on your local resource, especially with the whole idea of bring your own device becoming such a popular and prominent solution for simplifying access and device management, all kinds of other fun things that come along with that. If you let your developers use their own personal local machines for development, you're basically opening yourself up for a massive risk issue. Um, LastPass was the one that most recently brought up the fact that yes, a developer had downloaded a data set from one of their customers, and that data was exposed and was then potentially cracked by a set of nefarious individuals. Call them hackers. Um, but whatever the actual interaction is, the problem that we run into is that people do want to be able to develop locally. They want the responsiveness of local development, because if we look at what people think of, and I said this to a group of my friends recently, I said, hey, you shouldn't develop locally. There's no reason. And some of these folks are working at a company where they have a large staff of third party developers that help them with their applications. This is very common, and all of those developers get a laptop. It is a corporate laptop, so that's one step better, but it still means that your data is now being managed in multiple locations, and some of those locations are mobile, or potentially not locked down to the corporate standard, or accessible in some other fashion. I mean, the break-ins are not only just because a laptop was lying around and somebody stole it, right? So regardless of how the data gets there, having it on a local machine has all kinds of negatives. And actually, if we just think about those, the problems with local development, one, you can never be 100% certain that it's secured. If somebody gets access to a machine, let's say you were in a coffee shop because, hey, it's mobile and I can go to the coffee shop and do my work there. Isn't that so nice? So sure, you're doing your work, you get up, you go use the facilities, and sure enough, somebody takes your laptop with it still open and logged in because the screensaver hasn't kicked in yet, or you forgot to lock the screen before you got up. And suddenly they have access to a secured corporate entity and a corporate resource. Now, yes, things might time out after a short period of time if credentials are set up right. Access to a system is managed via multi-factor authentication. Hopefully, the YubiKey isn't plugged into the side of the laptop that you left on the table at the coffee shop. Um, right? It's just that you've opened yourself up to risk. Even worse is the model where you say, hey, look, we're going to support bring your own device. And now you're using a personal laptop, and that may also not be fully secured. Even if you have corporate policy to have VPN, to have antivirus and basically anti-malware tools already installed, that you have encryption at rest, that you have your screensaver kick in, that the system locks up. All those things are great, and I think they're certainly getting better. But the risks are still there, right? There's still a chance that if you're developing locally, you actually run into the security problems. So that's one area, security. Another area that is a real problem with developing locally is often getting the right environment stood up. Um, Especially with the explosion in microservices, especially with the need to build and manage resources locally, suddenly you have a much harder problem to manage, especially if you have heavyweight applications that are still a core part of your service. So if you need to set everything up locally, and I've worked with some companies recently that have tried to do this, you end up saying, well, my developer machine is now a 32 gig computer or a 64 gig computer with multiple cores in order to run all the additional services that make up the systems that the developer can develop their individual component. There are certainly tools, and there's a lot of tooling built around the idea of developing locally, and I get why people are trying to do this, but it really does add a layer of burden. Also, very few people are going to run their service off of their laptop. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. Not saying you shouldn't do it. Actually, I guess I would probably say you shouldn't do it. But I think more important is that you really need to consider how the system is going to run. So if you're going to go develop something new today, or even if you're developing something old or redeveloping something old, I think there's a huge value in looking at the development paradigm that lives around containerization. And I'm not going to push you to say, go 100% to the latest and greatest, go build Kubernetes and support all the sort of super scalar systems and environments. You probably ought to have an eye towards that. Hey, we all want our application to become the next unicorn, sure. But even with an eye towards that, the key is containerizing your application. As soon as you've containerized your application, there are a number of tools that support either running that locally. Yes, again, I think there's some problems with doing that, but at least you start running an environment that can be consistent with a deployment into production. Now, if you're talking about remote access, remote development, and remote containers, then there's also still the question of, well, where do you put your development tool? Where do you put your development stack? And more importantly, if things start to become remote in some fashion, how do I do things like debugging my application? I think a lot of developers are still very used to being able to set a breakpoint, see how the application behaves when it hits that breakpoint, or if that's where the problem is happening, to start to look at registers and all the components of the developer cycle within an environment. And if you look at some of the current IDEs that are available, things like VS Code is the one that I've been using most recently, but any of the systems IDEs that people like, the JetBrains tools, Eclipse, or any of its myriad of variants, all of these tool sets have this capability of basically creating a connection into a containerized environment and using that containerized environment as both your development platform and also your production platform. Now, I still think there's a disconnect here because I do think that it's important to have your development platform, your development environment. Containerizing that alone is fantastic. That is a production system of its own. It means that no longer do you have to try to figure out how to get your laptop set up with all the right code and capabilities and tools, et cetera. You can just bring in the container and launch from the container. So there's a hugely beneficial and very powerful solution just in that containerization piece in and of its own right. But there still is a question of latency and performance. And the first thing that you get into once you start talking about remote development is people say, yeah, but the latency, sitting on a VDI session, virtual desktop interface session, remote desktop type infrastructure, which is what most people think of when you say remote development, is really frustrating. I can't even explain how frustrating it is to some folks to really realize that, yeah, I have great bandwidth usually until I don't. And, I can be zipping along using the remote user interface. Everything seems to map well. I mean, I would say, at least at this point, the remote desktop tools, whether it's Amazon Workspaces or Microsoft Remote Desktop against any of the myriad of targets that support that, a Linux host or not, it doesn't matter anymore. the remote desktop tools, if you have the bandwidth, work great. Remote desktop to a local machine on your local network is fantastic. It is as equivalent as being on the machine. So at that level, it makes a lot of sense. But if we're talking about remote development, I'm on my laptop in a coffee shop. What kind of bandwidth am I actually getting to the system? I'm in my van life van with my Starlink dish, and what kind of bandwidth am I actually getting to be able to interact with the system? Um, yes, 90% of things are still streamed to me. So the high bandwidth downlink is sort of the critical piece, but latency becomes important. You're trying to type something and see how the system is interacting with or reacting to your typing, especially with a lot of the sort of the AI supported development tools that now start to come into the forefront. Latency becomes important. The other area where latency becomes important is when you are building your application for test. Even if you have an environment where it's interpreted code rather than compiled code, you're still probably setting up an environment, bringing down a bunch of libraries, and actually compiling things, playing around with the node environment and like npm or yarn sorts of package managers. Often those package managers take a long time to run on a weak network. Right. So again, the coffee shop network, your remote network on your phone or what have you, is often not adequate for speedy delivery of resources. So one of the benefits of a remote development environment, when it's established correctly and when it uses the right model of remote development, maybe this is remote development 2.0, um, is is that you can actually use potentially much higher bandwidth, much lower latency, consistent bandwidth sorts of environments, potentially even locally cached environments. So if you're working within your enterprise, maybe using a VPN to get into that enterprise, or even something like a zero trust infrastructure where you're talking directly to a development platform, which might be containerized, and hopefully it's still containerized. All of those resources actually can come together in a way that supports a more efficient development model and a paradigm for building systems that really changes the environment and changes the thinking of how we can develop things. So um, I think that's maybe the biggest differentiator here. Local development has a number of issues. Certainly, developers expect a local style interaction, and often a tool is still probably going to be local. Something like a VS Code, Visual Studio, JetBrains IDE. Again, I'm not trying to tell you what development tools to use, just the model for how you develop really wants to change. And if I can containerize both my development environment and my production workloads, and better yet, have them all sort of derive from the same infrastructure, I can actually start to build systems, have them run, have them be accessible and stable over time. And that alone is a very powerful shift to the thinking of how development can happen. Right. So instead of having to have everything local, instead of having to have a high bandwidth link to your local resource, instead of having to have, a 64 gig multi-core laptop in order to actually even have a chance of building and running your environment, and having enough memory and local disk space to be able to support that, instead of having to download potentially very large data sets, especially when we start talking about doing this kind of development against data analytics, big data, streaming data, right? The scale of data sets is also starting to stress the concept of local development. So we can come up with some really powerful models for getting to remote development by supporting the operational value of using remote resources with local interfaces. This alone, I think, can be incredibly powerful because now I can actually take all of the models of containerization and apply that to my development platform. Everybody can have a consistent development platform. I can use shared resources that can be shared. For example, I might have a caching service as a part of my database interaction. I can create caches that are one Redis instance, for example, but that can be shared across multiple end users. This alone is actually incredibly powerful because I can actually take that concept of one resource. It can be appropriately sized. It can be scaled up when developers exist and scaled down when developers don't. So I can actually build out infrastructure and automate this infrastructure in a way that the developers actually get high performance, low latency, very functional services that are effectively the managed services that they would be interacting with anyway, and they don't have to manage it themselves. They don't have to interact with it themselves, and yet they can still get a separated resource that looks like their own resource. Again, very powerful from a developer perspective. And it's this power of sharing those resources remotely, getting the latency benefit of it being remote, and yet still having a local interface. Again, this is where the VS Code is the tool that I've been using for this, has incredibly powerful and simple functions for building out a development environment. The thing it does not have is a good set of tools, and I don't think there are a good set of processes currently for going from a development environment through a git push to getting a production target container, right? Because we don't want our development tools in our production container. You do not want a Golang or C++ compiler in our development or in our production container. Interpreted languages have the problem of needing to have the interpreter available. So your nodes and your Pythons have that downside in a way, but really all we want on there is the absolute core resources that support our development model. So we can build this environment out. We can actually start to deploy to our core resources. Changes that are made locally can actually be committed into our core resource. That core resource can then build out a new container. That's where our CI engines start to come into play. And we can then be manipulating and working against that core resource in our production system, all in that same remote fashion. And I think that's where the rubber really starts to meet the road. The old school DVI, or VDI, sorry, a virtual display interface type systems model for development is a failure. We know that. I have never found a developer that likes to develop that way. There are developers that will develop that way because they have to, but that's not really our goal, right? The real value is in being able to say, I can change the paradigm. Let's turn off local development. Let's go from local development to systems production against containerized development resources and containerized environments. And that alone is incredibly powerful. It really changes the paradigm for the developer, because the developer no longer has to have a very specific piece of hardware. They can develop anywhere in the world potentially, as long as they have a secure pathway back to their core development resources. Latency becomes much less of an issue. It's still there. If you're on a boat in the middle of the ocean and you have very high latency, very low bandwidth links, development's still going to be painful, even with a local user interface. But it can be done, and you don't have to then say, oh, well, how am I going to download all of these libraries because I suddenly realized I needed to rebuild my development environment. Complete paradigm shift in how you can actually develop things. So don't think of remote development as a bad word. Don't think that local development is necessarily bad. There is just a better way to do it with modern remote 2.0 development styles and paradigms. And if you're interested, this is the sort of technology that we help people implement. So please feel free to reach out. Hit us up on the chat down below, or reach out to us on kumul.us, our website. We'd be more than happy to help you figure out how to implement the concepts of remote development for your environment. And if not, don't forget to stay tuned and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to have you listen to more of these chats as we continue to develop this. And we'll also be announcing some of our new classes that are specifically tuned to helping you enable this. Many of them will be live streamed either here or on our Cloud Computing Simplified channel, which is a sister channel to this community. Thanks so much for listening, and we look forward to talking to you next time.